A wealthy marquis arrived at Blackmere Castle to choose one of the two beautiful daughters as his future wife. Their father was convinced this marriage would save the family from ruin. Yet everyone was stunned when the marquis decided he favored neither of the beauties. He passed over the lovely elder sister and paid no heed to the intelligent younger one. Instead, his gaze fell upon the youngest daughter, an unremarkable, stout girl. Yet this girl, once deemed worthless, would go on to revitalize the desolate estate, become the marquis's pride, and turn into the one person he could never bear to lose. For generations, the House of Vallemont had survived on a simple illusion that wealth could. From the outside, Blackmere Castle still looked magnificent, with its 7 stone towers, iron gates, sweeping lawns, and ancient family crest carved above the entrance. Inside, however, the illusion was beginning to collapse. The roof above the western wing leaked whenever rain came. Several servants had left because their wages were months overdue, and the estate's remaining tenants had begun refusing payments because they no longer trusted Lord Alistair Vallemont to repair the land they depended upon. The old lord had spent years borrowing against the family fortune, always believing that another profitable season, another favorable marriage, or another political connection would rescue him. By the winter of his 56th year, there was almost nothing left to borrow. His greatest hope now rested on his 3 daughters. The eldest, Eveline, was 25 and famous in neighboring counties for her beauty, elegant gowns, and ability to command attention at every gathering. The second, Marianne, was 22 and possessed an education far beyond what most women of her station received, having studied history, languages, music, and philosophy with private tutors. The youngest, Clara, was 19 and almost completely forgotten by everyone who entered Blackmere Castle. She had no dazzling wardrobe, no celebrated accomplishments, and no reputation that could attract a powerful husband. Her dresses were usually made from fabric left behind after her sisters had received new ones, and her position at family gatherings was almost always near the servants' passage, where she could quietly disappear whenever important guests. On a cold afternoon in late November, Lord Alistair received word that Lord Evander Rookwood was approaching Blackmere. Evander was the newly inherited Marquis of Wrenford, a wealthy and powerful landowner whose influence stretched across 3 counties. He was 34 years old, unmarried, and known for avoiding society whenever possible. His older brother had died unexpectedly 2 years earlier, leaving Evander to inherit a title he had never expected to possess. Since then, he had become increasingly withdrawn, spending most of his time at Wrenford House managing tenants, repairing neglected farms, and restoring an estate that had suffered under years of careless administration. His visit to Blackmere was not officially a marriage negotiation, but everyone in the castle understood its purpose. Lord Alistair needed a wealthy son-in-law, and Evander needed a wife capable of giving him an heir and managing the household he had no interest in displaying to the world. For 3 hours, Eveline and Marianne prepared themselves as though they were preparing for battle. Eveline selected a pale blue gown designed to emphasize her beauty, while Marianne arranged several books and musical scores in the drawing room so that her accomplishments would appear effortless. Clara was not included in their preparations. Instead, she spent the afternoon in the kitchen checking the household supplies because the cook had discovered that the flour stores were nearly empty. Clara had become accustomed to solving problems nobody noticed until they became emergent. She knew which windows allowed rain into the east corridor, which servants were considering leaving, which horses needed better feed, and which merchants had quietly increased their prices because they knew Blackmere could no longer afford to bargain. She also knew that her father's greatest concern was not love, happiness, or even the future of his daughters. It was survival. Near sunset, the sound of approaching horses finally reached the castle. Evander arrived without the extravagant procession expected from a marquess. He came with only 2 riders and a single carriage, and the journey had left mud across his dark coat. He entered Blackmere with the appearance of a man who had spent the day outdoors, rather than preparing himself for inspection. His face was stern, his posture slightly rigid from an old injury, and his expression carried the permanent exhaustion of someone who had spent too many years carrying responsibilities that had never been meant for him. Lord Alistair welcomed him with excessive enthusiasm and immediately began presenting his daughters. Eveline performed everything perfectly. Her posture was flawless, her expression charming, and her clothing carefully chosen to suggest elegance without appearing desperate. Marianne followed with a display of intelligence and refinement, positioning herself beside the library shelves and making certain her extensive knowledge was impossible to overlook. Evander observed both women politely, but nothing in his expression suggested that he had been impressed. He seemed less interested in their beauty or accomplishments than in the room itself. He noticed the cold draft coming through the windows. He noticed the servants moving nervously because several fireplaces had gone out. He noticed the faded carpet beneath his boots and the cracked ceiling above the mantel. He was not examining potential brides. He was examining a failing estate. Clara remained in the background, carrying a tray of hot drinks from the kitchen. Nobody had instructed her to impress the visiting marquess, and she had no desire to do so. As she approached, she noticed that Evander had been sitting near the largest fireplace, but had not touched the sweetened wine offered to him. His hands were cold, and he repeatedly flexed the fingers of his left hand, revealing the stiffness of an old injury. Instead of giving him what the others had prepared, Clara quietly replaced the wine with a cup of plain black tea and placed it beside him. She did not remain nearby. She did not wait for approval. She simply returned to her position near the sideboard. Evander eventually noticed the change. The tea was strong, hot, and completely unsweetened. It was exactly what he preferred. More importantly, he noticed that Clara had somehow understood his preference without asking a single question. Throughout the following hour, Eveline attempted to draw his attention toward society, fashion, and the pleasures of London. Marianne demonstrated her musical knowledge and arranged an elaborate piece at the piano. Both women were performing exactly as they had been trained to perform. Clara, she watched. She noticed the way Evander's shoulders tightened whenever the piano became too loud. She noticed that he looked toward the windows whenever someone mentioned crowded social gatherings. She noticed that his expression softened whenever the room became quiet. For perhaps the first time that evening, someone was not trying to impress him. Someone was simply paying attention. When the formal visit ended, Evander stood near the doorway for several moments, looking across the drawing room. His gaze eventually settled on Clara. She was gathering abandoned cups from the table, completely unaware that the most powerful man in the room had begun reconsidering the purpose of his visit. He had arrived expecting to choose between two polished daughters from a declining aristocratic family. Instead, he had discovered a quiet young woman who seemed to understand the kind of life he wanted without needing to be told. Before leaving Blackmere that evening, Evander made a decision that would shock everyone inside the castle. He would not return for Eveline. He would not return for Marianne. He would return for Clara, the daughter nobody had thought worth presenting. The news of Evander Rookwood's decision spread through Blackmere Castle before the candles in the drawing room had burned halfway down. Lord Alastair first assumed that there had been some misunderstanding. Eveline refused to believe that a man of Evander's position could possibly have chosen Clara, while Marianne treated the entire matter as an insult to her intelligence and preparation. Clara herself remained silent because she had not yet been told what had happened. She was still in the servants' corridor, helping carry the remaining dishes into the kitchen, when her father finally summoned her. The conversation that followed was not a celebration. Lord Alastair explained that Evander intended to marry her within the month, and that the arrangement would provide Blackmere with enough money to survive. Clara listened without interruption. She had imagined many futures for herself, but none had included becoming the wife of a marquis she had met only once. Yet there was something strangely calm about the prospect. For years, Blackmere had felt like a room where everyone was shouting at once. Wrenford, from what she had heard, was remote and quiet. The marriage would be a bargain, but perhaps it would also be an escape. Evander returned 3 days later with his solicitor and several sealed documents. The arrangements were surprisingly generous. He would settle Blackmere's immediate debts, provide Clara with a substantial personal allowance, and guarantee that the estate's tenants would not be evicted to cover Lord Alastair's remaining obligations. There was, however, one condition that mattered more than all the others. After the wedding, Clara would live permanently at Wrenford, and her father and sisters would not be permitted to use her marriage as another source of money. Evander had clearly understood the weakness of families who treated marriage as an endless financial resource. Lord Alistair accepted every condition because he had little choice. Eveline and Marianne were furious. Their anger was not really directed at Clara, although she became the easiest target. They believed Evander had chosen the wrong woman. They saw Clara's quietness as proof of weakness and assumed that his decision had been made because he wanted a wife who would never challenge him. Clara understood their interpretation, but did not correct it. She had spent too many years being underestimated to waste energy proving people wrong. The wedding took place 12 days later in a small stone chapel outside Blackmere. There were no grand celebrations, no elaborate procession, and no crowd of aristocratic guests. Evander wanted privacy, and Clara had no reason to object. She wore a simple ivory dress that had been altered from one of Marianne's older gowns. When the ceremony ended, she became the Marchioness of Wrenford, without having spoken a single word to her new husband beyond what formal courtesy required. Their journey to Wrenford took nearly 2 days. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled north, becoming rougher and more isolated. Fields gave way to forests, forests to hills, and eventually the road climbed toward a broad valley surrounded by dark mountains. Clara watched everything through the carriage window. She had never traveled so far from Blackmere. Evander noticed her fascination, but did not interrupt it. He had expected nervousness, perhaps tears, or questions about what awaited her. Instead, Clara seemed interested in the landscape itself. Wrenford House appeared at the end of a long road lined with ancient trees. It was an enormous grey residence built against a hillside, with narrow windows, heavy stone walls, and a central tower rising above the surrounding roofs. It was beautiful in a severe way, but it lacked warmth. The gardens were neglected, the fountains were dry, and several shutters hung crookedly from their hinges. Clara immediately understood why Evander had spent so much time away from the house. Wrenford was not a home. It was a monument that had forgotten how to live. The housekeeper, Mrs. Harrow, received the new Marchioness with cautious politeness. She had served the family for 30 years and had seen several women arrive at Wrenford, only to leave after discovering how difficult the estate could be. Clara was shown to a private. The rooms were large but cold, with furniture covered in protective cloth and fireplaces that had not been used in years. Evander explained through his actions rather than words that she would have complete authority over her household and that he would not interfere unless necessary. Then he disappeared into his study. The first weeks of the marriage were strangely peaceful. Evander rose before sunrise and spent most of his days inspecting farms, repairing roads, settling disputes, and reviewing estate accounts. Clara spent her time exploring Wrenford. She discovered unused rooms filled with broken furniture, cupboards stocked with spoiled supplies, servants working with outdated equipment, and records that had not been properly reviewed for years. Nobody had asked her to fix anything. Nobody expected her to care. That made her decision easier. She began with the kitchens. She noticed that enormous quantities of food were being ordered every week, despite the fact that fewer than 20 people lived in the main house. She reorganized the supplies, negotiated with local merchants, and redirected excess food toward families in the nearby village. Then she examined the household accounts and found that several vendors were charging Wrenford nearly twice the normal market price. She did not confront them dramatically. She simply began comparing records, visiting suppliers, and replacing those who had taken advantage of the estate's neglect. Within 3 weeks, household expenses had fallen dramatically. The servants began to notice that the new Marchioness did not merely give orders from behind. She worked beside them. She helped clean rooms, inspected storerooms, repaired torn curtains, and even spent an afternoon helping restore the old greenhouse. Mrs. Harrow initially regarded these habits as inappropriate for a woman of Clara's rank, but slowly her opinion changed. Evander noticed the changes later. One evening, he returned from the northern farms and discovered that the main entrance no longer smelled of damp stone. The carpets had been cleaned, the windows were repaired, lamps had been placed along the darker corridors. The kitchens were warmer, the servants less anxious, and the gardens had begun to show signs of life. He walked through the house without announcing himself, and realized that the place felt different. It was still quiet, but the silence no longer felt abandoned. A few days later, Clara entered his study carrying a stack of corrected estate records. She had discovered that several tenant families were paying rent for land that had become unusable because an old irrigation channel had collapsed. The problem had been recorded in the estate books for nearly 4 years, but nobody had acted because the previous steward had considered the repairs too expensive. Clara had calculated that repairing the channel would cost less than continuing to lose the rent. Evander studied her figures and immediately approved the work. It was the first time he began to see her not as the quiet wife he had chosen for convenience, but as someone capable of understanding the complicated machinery of an estate. Their marriage remained distant, yet something had changed. They began sharing small pieces of their days. Clara left tea outside his study when she knew he had been working too long. Evander began returning earlier when he knew she was in the gardens. They rarely needed words. Their companionship developed through routine, observation, and trust. Neither noticed exactly when the distance between them began to disappear. But by the beginning of spring, Wrenford House no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a place that was slowly becoming theirs. Spring arrived late at Wrenford, bringing cold rain, swollen streams, and a pale green haze across the hills. By then, Clara had become part of the rhythm of the estate. She knew which servants preferred to begin work before sunrise, which tenants needed extra time to pay after a poor harvest, and which corridors remained cold no matter how many fires were lit. She also knew Evander's habits. He worked until exhaustion, skipped meals when estate problems became complicated, and often returned from the northern farms with mud on his boots and pain visible in the way he moved. Their marriage had not yet become what either of them might have imagined before the wedding. There was no dramatic declaration of affection, no sudden transformation, and no expectation that either would abandon the careful boundaries they had established. Instead, their relationship grew through hundreds of small moments that neither thought important enough to name. Clara began leaving a lamp burning outside his study when she knew he would return late. Evander began asking the kitchen to prepare the particular tea she preferred, even though he had never been a man who noticed such details. They started taking meals at the same table instead of eating separately. Sometimes the meals passed almost entirely in silence, yet the silence had become comfortable. Clara would read while Evander examined estate documents, and the simple knowledge that another person was nearby seemed to make the long evenings easier for both of them. One afternoon, Clara discovered a neglected orchard behind the western wall. The trees had been damaged by years of poor pruning, but several still produced fruit. She ordered the dead branches removed and had the healthiest trees carefully restored. Within weeks, the orchard began showing signs of recovery. Evander found her there one evening, standing beneath the old apple trees with mud on the hem of her dress. The sight affected him more deeply. At Blackmere, Clara had been invisible because nobody had bothered to look closely. At Wrenford, she was becoming impossible to overlook. Yet just as their life settled into a peaceful routine, trouble began to rise beyond the estate. A group of neighboring landowners had discovered that Wrenford's finances were improving. For years, they had assumed Evander would eventually sell part of his northern property because the estate seemed too expensive to maintain. Now that Clara had reduced expenses and restored several neglected farms, the value of the land was increasing. One particular neighbor, Lord Corvin Ashford, began appearing at social gatherings and spreading rumors that the new Marchioness had manipulated her husband into giving her control over the rumors were ridiculous, but they were dangerous because reputation was currency among the aristocracy. Clara's family also reappeared. Lord Alistair sent letters requesting additional financial assistance, claiming that Blackmere required repairs that only Evander could afford. Eveline had married a minor nobleman whose debts were already growing, while Marianne had begun considering a political marriage that would require a substantial dowry. Clara refused to allow Wrenford's money to become another endless supply for her family. Evander quietly supported the decision. That support meant more to her than any expensive gift could have. For the first time in her life, Clara realized that someone was protecting her boundaries instead of demanding that she sacrifice. Summer brought a period of prosperity. The repaired irrigation system improved the harvest. The orchard produced its first healthy crop in years, and several tenant families began paying their debts again. Wrenford servants became more confident, and even Mrs. Harrow occasionally allowed herself to smile. Evander's attention also changed. He no longer viewed Clara simply as the person who had made the house more efficient. He began noticing the smallest things about her. He noticed how she became completely absorbed when reading, how she always checked whether the youngest kitchen servants had eaten before leaving the dining room, and how she never entered a room without first observing what had changed since her previous visit. Clara noticed changes in him as well. His expression softened more often. He laughed occasionally, though usually when something unexpected happened. He stopped disappearing immediately after dinner and began lingering near her when she worked in the library. Neither acknowledged what was happening, perhaps because both feared disturbing the fragile peace they had created. Then, in early autumn, the river rose after 3 days of relentless rain. The northern bridge, already weakened by years of flooding, finally collapsed during the night. The damage cut off several farms from the main road, trapping families on the opposite side of the valley. Evander left before dawn to inspect the destruction. Clara remained at Wrenford long enough to organize food, blankets, medicine, and horses for the affected tenants. By midday, she realized that the situation was worse than expected. Several cottages had flooded, and one family had been trapped inside a house surrounded by fast-moving water. Clara immediately organized the servants and stable workers into a rescue group. She had no military experience and no desire to pretend otherwise, but she understood logistics. She knew which horses were strongest, which paths remained passable, and where the old stone crossing might still be usable. By the time Evander returned, Clara was already gone. He learned that she had taken a small group of workers toward the flooded farms. Fear replaced every other emotion inside him. He had spent years believing that he could survive losing anything because he had already lost so much. But the thought of Clara being exposed to the dangerous river made that belief collapse. He rode through the rain without waiting for an escort. When he reached the valley, he found Clara standing on the remains of the old crossing, directing the rescue of a family trapped beyond the water. She had tied a rope around her waist and crossed part way through the current to reach them. The river was violent, cold, and unpredictable. Evander immediately understood that one mistake could cost her life. He joined the rescue effort without hesitation. Together, they brought the trapped family back across the damaged crossing. Clara was exhausted by the time they returned to higher ground, her clothing soaked and her hands shaking from cold. Evander's anger at her recklessness was overwhelmed by relief. He had never realized how deeply she had become part of his life until the possibility of losing her had made the world suddenly meaningless. That evening, after the rain finally stopped, they returned to Wrenford in silence. Clara was taken to the kitchen because it was the warmest room in the house. Evander remained nearby until her hands stopped trembling. Neither of them understood that the flood had changed something permanent. Their marriage had begun as an arrangement between two people who needed practical solutions. It had slowly become companionship. Now, without either intending it, it had become something much more dangerous. They had begun to need each other emotionally. And once a person realizes that another human being has become essential, the possibility of losing them becomes far more frightening than loneliness ever was. The weeks following the flood changed the atmosphere at Wrenford more than either Clara or Evander expected. The damaged bridge was rebuilt, the flooded cottages were repaired, and the tenants gradually returned to their ordinary lives. But something between the Marquess and his wife had become impossible to ignore. Evander had always been a man who controlled his emotions by keeping himself busy. Whenever grief or fear threatened to surface, he buried himself beneath estate accounts, inspections, correspondence, and endless physical work. Clara had become the one person who could interrupt that pattern without forcing him to explain himself. She never demanded his attention. She simply appeared when she knew he had worked too long, placed food beside his papers, adjusted the fire, or left a fresh cup of tea within reach. Her presence had become part of his daily life so gradually that he could no longer imagine the house without it. Clara experienced the same transformation from the opposite direction. At Blackmere, she had learned to expect disappointment. If she needed something, she solved the problem herself. If she was hurt, she remained quiet. If she succeeded, nobody noticed. At Wrenford, however, she had begun to discover that someone might actually care whether she was tired, frightened, or unhappy. Evander rarely expressed affection openly, but his actions became increasingly obvious. He began accompanying her when she inspected the gardens. He repaired the loose wooden steps outside her favorite greenhouse himself, rather than allowing a servant to handle the task. When autumn winds became colder, a heavier cloak appeared in her room without explanation. Clara knew exactly who had ordered it. Neither acknowledged the change. Then Lord Corvin Ashford made his move. He had learned that Evander planned to expand Wrenford's agricultural operations, and he wanted the northern valley for himself. He approached several influential families and suggested that Evander's estate was unstable because its new Marchioness was controlling household finances beyond her position. The rumors spread quickly. Invitations to several important gatherings suddenly disappeared. A few merchants became hesitant to extend credit. More troublingly, an anonymous report was sent to the regional magistrate accusing Wrenford of manipulating tenant agreements. Evander recognized the attack immediately. Someone was attempting to weaken his reputation before making a claim on his land. Clara began reviewing every estate document. She discovered inconsistencies in several older contracts, but none were serious enough to justify the accusations. Then she found something buried inside an old collection of correspondence belonging to Evander's late father. A series of letters revealed that Lord Ashford had previously attempted to purchase portions of Wrenford land through intermediaries. The transactions had failed because Evander's father refused to sell. More importantly, one letter suggested that Ashford had deliberately spread false information about the estate in order to force a future sale at a lower price. Clara realized that the current accusations were part of the same strategy. She spent several nights organizing the documents, comparing dates, names, payments, and signatures. Evander watched her work, but did not interfere. He had learned to trust her judgment completely. When the evidence was finally assembled, it showed that the accusations against Wrenford had been manufactured. The magistrate dismissed the complaint, and Lord Ashford's reputation suffered a severe blow. Yet the victory came at a personal cost. During the investigation, Clara received another letter from Blackmere. Her father was seriously ill, and the family requested that she return home immediately. The message reopened an old wound. Clara felt obligated to go, even though she knew that returning to Blackmere meant entering the same environment from which she had escaped. Evander offered to accompany her, but Clara refused. She believed the journey was something she needed to face alone. She traveled south during the first week of winter. Blackmere looked smaller than she remembered. The walls were stained by damp. The gardens had become overgrown, and the drawing room where Evander had first seen her now seemed painfully familiar. Eveline was there, still proud, but visibly exhausted by the demands of her marriage. Marianne had become bitter after several failed attempts to secure a politically advantageous match. Lord Alistair was confined to his bed, his health failing rapidly. Clara spent several days managing his affairs and discovered that despite everything, she still felt compassion for him. He had failed her as a father, but he was still the man who had raised her. She did not forgive the past in a single moment. Instead, when she returned to Wrenford, she expected the estate to feel exactly as she had left it. It did not. The moment she stepped through the doors, she realized how deeply she had come to belong there. The servants greeted her with visible relief. Mrs. Harrow had prepared her favorite room. The gardens had been protected from the first heavy frost. Even the greenhouse had been repaired. Evander himself was waiting in the entrance hall. He did not greet her with the formal distance he had once maintained. He simply stood there, looking at her as though he had been holding his breath for the entire time she had been away. Clara understood then that Wrenford was no longer merely the place where her marriage had taken her. It was home. That night, they ate together in the smaller dining room. There was no need for ceremony. The conversation was carried entirely through expressions, gestures, and the quiet familiarity that had grown between them. Clara realized that Evander had changed more than she had noticed. The severe marquis who had arrived at Blackmere was gone. In his place stood a man who smiled more easily, slept more peacefully, and no longer seemed burdened by the belief that solitude was the safest way to live. Winter deepened around Wrenford. Snow covered the hills, the roads disappeared beneath white drifts, and the estate became isolated once again. One evening, a violent storm struck without warning. The wind tore branches from the old trees and sent snow against the windows with tremendous force. Clara was in the greenhouse checking the heating pipes when part of the roof suddenly collapsed. She escaped before the structure gave way completely, but the storm separated her from the main house. Evander discovered that she was missing and immediately went outside to search for her. The servants attempted to stop him because the weather was becoming dangerous, but he refused to remain inside. He crossed the gardens through deep snow and eventually found Clara near the ruined greenhouse. She had injured her ankle and could no longer walk. Evander carried her back through the storm himself. The journey was slow, painful, and dangerous. By the time they reached the house, both were covered in snow. Clara was placed near the great kitchen fire while Evander remained beside her. The servants watched in silence as the Marquess refused to leave until he was certain she was safe. The storm continued through the night, but inside Wrenford there was no fear. Clara finally understood that the man who had once chosen her because she represented peace had discovered something far more valuable. He no longer wanted peace without her. He wanted a life that included her, even when that life was complicated, demanding, and uncertain. And Evander had reached the same realization. The woman nobody had chosen at Blackmere had become the one person he could no longer imagine losing. The storm lasted for 3 days, covering Wrenford and the surrounding valley in a thick blanket of snow. Roads disappeared, the river froze along its edges, and communication with the nearest towns became impossible. For most of the household, the isolation was frightening, but for Clara and Evander, it created a strange period of peace. The outside world could no longer reach them. There were no letters demanding attention, no visitors carrying rumors, and no estate disputes requiring immediate decisions. There was only the quiet house, the fire, the snow, and the two people who had gradually become the center of each other's lives. Clara's ankle was badly bruised, but not broken. She spent most of the first day resting in a small sitting room beside the kitchen fireplace. Evander remained nearby, pretending to study estate documents while repeatedly looking toward her chair. He had never been good at hiding concern, and Clara had become far too familiar with his habits to misunderstand it. She noticed that he had barely slept since finding her in the greenhouse. His injured leg was causing him pain from the difficult journey through the snow, yet he refused to mention it. Clara eventually noticed the stiffness in his movements and understood that he was suffering. Without ceremony, she arranged a chair beside the fire and placed a warm blanket over his legs. It was a small act, but it revealed how completely their relationship had changed. They were no longer two strangers sharing a marriage for convenience. They had become partners who instinctively cared for each other. During the second night of the storm, the household gathered in the same room because the other fireplaces had become difficult to maintain. Mrs. Harrow, several servants, and the kitchen staff sat quietly near the fire while Clara reviewed household records. Evander sat opposite her with a book in his hands. Neither was reading. They had discovered that they enjoyed At some point during the night, Clara found an old bundle of letters inside a wooden cabinet. The letters had belonged to Evander's mother, who had died when he was young. Clara recognized the family seal, but did not open them. She placed them carefully on the table and waited. Evander eventually noticed them. His expression changed immediately. He had not seen those letters in many years. He opened the bundle and spent a long time reading the first few pages. Clara did not ask what they contained. She understood that some memories needed silence rather than questions. Evander eventually placed the letters back inside the cabinet. The experience seemed to break something inside him, not painfully, but gently. For most of his adult life, he had believed that emotional distance protected people from loss. He had watched his family fall apart, inherited responsibilities after his brother's death, and learned that attachment could become another form of vulnerability. His solution had been simple: never allow anyone close enough to hurt him. Clara had somehow defeated that strategy without ever attacking it. She had entered his life quietly and changed it through ordinary things. She repaired the household accounts. She restored the gardens. She helped the tenants. She brought warmth into rooms that had been cold for years. Most importantly, she had never demanded that he become someone else. She had accepted him exactly as he was, while quietly encouraging him to live rather than merely endure. By the third day, the storm finally began to weaken. The servants cleared snow from the main entrance, and the first narrow road toward the village became passable. Evander spent the morning inspecting the damage. Several trees had fallen, one barn had lost part of its roof, and the greenhouse was beyond immediate repair. Yet the estate had survived. Clara walked slowly through the gardens with a cane, inspecting the destruction. The greenhouse had been one of her favorite places, and seeing it ruined hurt more than she admitted. Evander noticed her disappointment. Without making a dramatic gesture, he ordered the gardeners to preserve every surviving plant and instructed the estate architect to design a new greenhouse stronger than the old one. Clara realized that he had remembered every detail of the place she loved. As winter continued, Wrenford began to change in ways neither of them had planned. The old greenhouse was rebuilt with larger windows and stronger iron supports. The orchard expanded. The tenants received better contracts. The estate became financially stable enough to employ additional workers and improve the surrounding roads. Clara's influence became respected throughout the valley. She was no longer described as the quiet young woman from Blackmere. She had become known as the Marchioness who listened to tenants, understood accounts, and solved problems before they became disasters. Evander's reputation changed as well. He was still reserved, still uncomfortable at large gatherings, but people noticed that he seemed less severe. He attended local events occasionally, not because he had suddenly developed a love for society, but because Clara enjoyed seeing the community benefit from Wrenford's prosperity. Their lives had become balanced. Neither had sacrificed their identity for the other. Instead, they had created a shared world where both could breathe. Meanwhile, Blackmere continued to decline. Lord Alistair's health worsened, and Eveline's marriage became increasingly unstable. Marianne eventually accepted a modest proposal from a respectable scholar, rather than waiting for the powerful husband she had once imagined. The family that had once measured Clara's worth by her ability to attract attention slowly realized that the quiet daughter they had ignored had built the most stable life among them. When Lord Alistair died in early spring, Clara returned to Blackmere for the funeral. She walked through the old halls one final time. The room seemed smaller than before, and the silence felt completely different. She no longer felt invisible. She no longer needed anyone there to recognize her value. Her life was waiting for her beyond those gates. After the funeral, Clara prepared to leave. Eveline and Marianne stood with her near the entrance. There was no dramatic reconciliation. Years of neglect could not be erased by a few sentimental moments. But there was something close to understanding in their expressions. They had finally realized that Clara's greatest strength had never been her ability to impress powerful people. It had been her ability. She returned to Wrenford under a clear spring sky. The mountains were bright with melting snow, and the river had begun flowing freely again. Evander was waiting at the entrance. He had never before admitted how much he disliked her traveling without him. Clara saw the relief in his expression before he attempted to hide it. She entered the house and immediately noticed the scent of fresh wood and flowers. The rebuilt greenhouse had been completed sooner than expected. Evander had arranged for the first spring blossoms to be planted inside. It was not an extravagant romantic gesture. It was something more meaningful to Clara. He had remembered what mattered to her. That evening, they walked through the greenhouse together. The glass roof reflected the fading sunlight, and the young plants were beginning. Clara looked around and realized how far they had traveled from the day she had first entered Wrenford. She had arrived believing that she had been traded from one household to another. She had expected to live quietly beside a distant husband and disappear into another grand house. Instead, she had found a place where her judgment mattered, where her presence was valued, and where the man who had originally chosen her because she seemed invisible had learned to see her more clearly than anyone ever had. Evander had also changed. The man who had once believed that an empty house was peaceful now understood that emptiness was simply another form of loneliness. He no longer wanted a silent estate. He wanted a home filled with the quiet presence of the woman who had transformed it. Their marriage had begun as a practical arrangement, But practicality had slowly given way to loyalty, loyalty to trust, and trust to something deeper that neither needed to define. Outside, spring rain began tapping gently against the glass. Clara and Evander remained in the greenhouse long after the servants had finished their work. Wrenford was no longer a cold monument on a distant hill. It had become a living place, shaped by two people who had both once believed that they were better off alone. And for the first time, neither of them was afraid of what the future might bring. The years that followed were quieter than either Clara or Evander had once imagined, but they were not empty. Wrenford continued to grow, not through sudden wealth or grand political influence, but through careful decisions made. The farms became productive again. The tenants gradually paid their debts, and the roads connecting the valley to nearby towns were repaired. The estate's accounts, once filled with warnings and unpaid obligations, became orderly and reliable. Clara took responsibility for the household and charitable work, while Evander concentrated on the land and the legal affairs surrounding the marquessate. They worked differently, but their goals had become the same. Neither cared about becoming the most admired family in the county. They cared about creating something that would last. The new greenhouse became the center of Clara's world. What had begun as a ruined structure became a place filled with flowers, herbs, young fruit trees, and plants gathered from distant regions. Clara spent hours there whenever the weather allowed. Evander often joined her after finishing his work, sometimes bringing estate papers with him, and sometimes bringing nothing at all. The greenhouse became their private refuge, a place where neither title nor responsibility seemed important. Years earlier, Evander had chosen Clara because she seemed unlikely to disturb the quiet life he wanted. He had believed he was choosing simplicity. He had not understood that simplicity could contain companionship, loyalty, and affection. Clara had entered Wrenford believing that marriage was simply another obligation imposed upon her by circumstances. She had expected to remain unnoticed, just as she had at Blackmere. Instead, she discovered that being seen by one person could change the way. Their relationship never became dramatic in the way society expected romantic stories to become dramatic. There were no grand public declarations, no extravagant celebrations, and no sudden transformation into people they were not. Their affection remained quiet, because quietness was part of who they were. It appeared in ordinary routines. Evander remembered which flowers Clara preferred in spring. Clara knew when his old injury was causing him pain before he mentioned it. He made certain that she never traveled alone during dangerous weather. She checked the estate accounts whenever he became too busy to notice them. He repaired small things around the greenhouse because he knew she hated seeing anything neglected. She kept the library warm because she knew he liked working there on winter evenings. Their love existed in thousands of details that outsiders might never notice. Several years after their marriage, Wrenford hosted its first large gathering in decades. The occasion was not designed to display wealth. It was held to celebrate the completion of the Valley Road and the opening of a new school funded jointly by the estate and several local families. Nobles from neighboring counties attended, along with merchants, farmers, teachers, and tenants. Clara stood beside Evander as people entered the grounds. She noticed that many guests who had once ignored her now treated her with genuine respect. Some remembered the rumors spread during the early years of her marriage. Others remembered how little anyone had thought of her when she first arrived at Wrenford. Their opinions no longer mattered. Clara had learned that reputation built slowly through consistent actions was stronger than any first impression. During the celebration, she saw Eveline and Marianne arrive. Time had changed both sisters. Eveline's marriage had eventually stabilized after she and her husband learned to live within their means. Marianne had become a respected scholar's wife and had developed a peaceful life far removed from the ambitious future she once imagined. They had remained in occasional contact with Clara, but their relationship was never restored to what it might have been if their childhood had been different. Still, there was no bitterness between them anymore. Clara had learned that forgiveness did not require forgetting. It simply meant refusing to allow the past to control the future. As the afternoon faded, the guests gradually departed. The gardens became quiet again, and the servants began clearing the tables. Clara returned to the greenhouse. She expected to find it empty, but Evander was already there. He stood beside the oldest apple tree, the same tree she had restored during her first spring at Wrenford. It had grown taller than both of them, and produced its first heavy harvest that year. Clara looked at the branches and remembered the woman she had once been. She remembered standing in Blackmere's kitchen, repairing household problems that nobody thanked her for solving. She remembered watching Eveline and Marianne prepare to meet Evander, while nobody bothered to tell her that she might be expected to appear. She remembered the first cup of tea she had placed beside him, and how little significance she had attached to the moment. At the time, she had not known that a small act of observation would alter the direction of her entire life. Evander remembered that evening too. He had arrived at Blackmere searching for a practical arrangement. He had wanted a wife who wouldn't demand attention, a household that would remain quiet, and a future that could be controlled. Instead, he had found someone who made control unnecessary. Clara had taught him that peace did not come from shutting people out. It came from finding someone with whom silence felt safe. As evening settled over Wrenford, the final light of the sun passed through the greenhouse windows and covered the plants in gold. Clara stood among the flowers while Evander remained nearby. The house behind them was no longer the cold, neglected monument he had inherited. It was warm, active, and full of memories they had created together. The servants who had once feared losing their positions now had secure employment. The tenants who had once worried about eviction now owned improved farms. The gardens that had once been overgrown were filled with color. The valley that had once seemed forgotten had become prosperous. All of it had begun with two people who had entered a marriage expecting almost nothing from each other. Clara eventually understood the deeper irony of her story. At Blackmere, she had been considered the least valuable daughter because she did not possess she was not the most beautiful, the most accomplished, or the most socially confident. She was simply observant, patient, practical, and kind. Those qualities had seemed ordinary because nobody had bothered to look closely enough to understand their value. Evander had looked closely. That was the difference. He had noticed the things everyone else overlooked. He had noticed the tea she chose, the way she watched a room, the way she solved problems without demanding praise, and the way she understood that silence could be comforting, rather than empty. He had chosen her for the wrong reason at first, but the marriage had given them both the opportunity to discover the right one. Their lives were not perfect. Difficult winters would return. Crops would sometimes fail. Estate illness and loss were unavoidable parts of life. But neither feared those things in the same way anymore. They had learned that a strong home was not a place untouched by hardship. It was a place where hardship could be faced together. Years later, people would still tell the story of the quiet Marchioness who transformed Wrenford. Some would focus on the financial recovery of the estate. Others would remember the restored farms, the new school, or the greenhouse that became famous throughout the region. A few would even remember that she had once been the daughter nobody considered important enough to notice. But the truth of the story was much simpler. Clara had never needed to become someone extraordinary. She had only needed to be seen for who she already was. Evander had never he had needed a life where silence could be shared with someone he trusted. Their marriage began as a bargain between necessity and convenience, but time turned that bargain into partnership, and partnership into devotion. The woman nobody had chosen at Blackmere became the woman who transformed Wrenford. The man who had once feared attachment discovered that the greatest strength in his life came from allowing another person to matter. And the castle that had once stood cold and empty on the hillside finally became what neither of them had known they were searching for. It became home.